At this time, I would like to turn today's program over to Coley Boone. Ms. Boone, the floor is yours.
Thank you for joining our webinar on forklift safety. My name is Coley Boone, and I'll be telling you why forklift safety in the workplace is important. Powered industrial trucks, commonly called forklifts or lift trucks, are used in many industries, primarily to move materials. They can also be used to raise, lower, or remove large objects or a number of smaller objects on pallets or in boxes, crates, or other containers. Forklifts can either be ridden by the operator or controlled by a walking operator. Over-the-road haulage trucks and earth-moving equipment that has been modified to accept forks are not considered forklifts. Workplace type and conditions are factors and hazards commonly associated with forklifts. For example, retail establishments often face greater challenges than other work sites in maintaining pedestrian safety. Beyond that, many workers can also be injured when 1, lift trucks are inadvertently driven off a loading dock, 2, when lifts fall between docks and an unsecured trailer, 3, when they are struck by a lift truck or when they fall while on elevated pallets and tines. Determining the best way to protect workers from injury largely depends on the type of truck operated and the work site where it's being used. Employers must ensure that each powered industrial truck operator is competent to operate a powered industrial truck safely. Keep in mind it is a violation of federal law for anyone under 18 years of age to operate a forklift or for anyone over 18 years of age who is not properly trained and certified to do so. There is a great risk of injury or death when a forklift operator has not been trained in the principles of physics that allows a forklift to lift heavy loads, is not familiar with how a particular forklift operates the forklift carelessly, unsafely, or without knowing the hazards, or uses a forklift that is not safe due to malfunctioning, missing parts, or unapproved alterations. Approximately 35,000 serious injuries and 62,000 non-serious injuries involving forklifts occur in the United States every year. OSHA estimates 11% of all forklifts are involved in accidents every year. Ensure a safe ride by knowing what to do. Conduct a pre-check, know your equipment, and know your route of travel and what hazards you may encounter along the way. Next, we have Scott Hunter, Loss Control Consultant for Allocop. His knowledge of forklift safety will help you keep you and your employees safe in the workplace.
Thank you, Coley. We're going to go a little more in depth into some of those items that Coley just mentioned. Number one being know your equipment, having a good understanding of the equipment that you're operating. Know how the controls work, know how the pedals work. Knowing how to make the proper adjustments, understanding your load and the proper load rating. Understanding the turn radius of your forklift. Forklift is not going to turn in the same manner that an automobile is going to turn. Forklifts have rear wheel steering, which is going to cause the back end of the lift to swing wide when making turns. Also understanding the balance points of your load and of the forklift. Having an understanding of the forklift's center of gravity and how that center of gravity is going to change and shift forward as you take on a load and then raise that load. Also, we're going to talk a little bit in some later slides on proper overhead clearance as well as side-to-side clearance when operating the forklift. One of the things that we need to run through are pre-use safety checks. This is an OSHA requirement. And for more information on OSHA requirements as it relates to powered industrial trucks, and the majority of the things that you're going to see us talk about today in this webinar, you can go to OSHA's website, and in their search bar, which is powered by Google, type in CFR 1910-178, which is OSHA's powered industrial truck standard, or you can just type in powered industrial truck, and OSHA is going to give you a plethora of information. So again, back to the pre-use safety checks. Before each use, before each shift, and before the forklift is used initially during the shift, you want to go through a list of safety checks. You want to make sure that all the controls are working properly. Look around the forklift. Make sure there's no fluid leaks. Make sure there's no damaged or defective parts on the forklift. Make sure all the safety features are working properly on the forklift. The horn, the backup alarm, lights. Make sure the brakes are working properly. Check your seat belt. Make sure that it's not damaged or defective in any way. Make sure that there's a fire extinguisher located somewhere on the forklift. Forklifts are required to have a fire extinguisher on them. Make sure that fire extinguisher is properly charged. That fire extinguisher that's located on your forklift should also be rolled into your normal fire extinguisher monthly inspections as well. Also, you want to make sure that the forklift is fueled properly or that the battery is properly charged before you put it into use each day. If you find any damages or defects, anything that may deem that forklift unsafe, place that lift out of service immediately. Tag it as such. Tag it that it's out of service and it's not to be used for any reasons. And then contact whoever your service provider is for your forklift so that they can get a technician out to you to either repair the forklift or replace it and not use that defective lift. Just some general safety rules that we're going to talk about when we're operating a forklift. Number one is make sure that you use your seatbelt. Wear your seatbelt at all times when operating a forklift. Number one, this is also an OSHA violation to operate a forklift without wearing the safety restraint. Also, just in case there's any confusion, if you have an older forklift and it is not outfitted with a seatbelt from the manufacturer, and this would have to be a pretty old lift, but OSHA's stance on that is if your forklift has a seatbelt, you're required to use it. If your forklift does not have a seatbelt, then, of course, you can't be required to use something that's not there. But you have to do a little research, make sure the manufacturer does not make a kit to go back and retrofit that old forklift with a seatbelt. Because if that is the case, you're required to purchase that retro kit and go back and outfit that forklift with a seatbelt. Also, you want to make sure that you operate the forklift only in designated areas where it's approved to be operated. Try to stay clear of areas that have high pedestrian traffic if that's possible. You also want to make sure that you're operating the forklift in an area where the ventilation is adequate. Do not exceed any floor load ratings. Check and make sure that you have an understanding of what the working load limits are on the surfaces that you're going to be working. Never exceed the forklift's rated capacity. The forklift's rated capacity can be found on the nameplate, and that's typically going to be somewhere on the mast or somewhere near the seat, but you're going to be able to find that rated capacity stamped somewhere there on the nameplate. Never use the forklift to tow or push another vehicle or pieces of equipment. That's not what it's designed for. It's designed for lifting and material handling. For outdoor use, and you only want to use approved lifts in hazardous locations. For outdoor use, you want to use a pneumatic wheel forklift for irregular terrain or if you're going to be traveling on streets. A good example of that is probably going to be a lull that's going to have the bigger all-terrain tires on it, which you would see commonly used in outdoor construction-type settings. And then hard wheel forklifts, those are going to be used for indoor. Those are going to be for indoor use only. As those hard wheels have difficulty being operated in outdoor rougher terrain. Before traveling with a load, you want to make sure that you tilt the mast back. Make sure that you maintain the forks when traveling about 4 to 6 inches off of the floor. This is going to be where the load is going to be the most stable and easiest to maneuver with. Before entering a trailer, you want to make sure that the dock boards are properly attached. You want to get off the forklift, go onto the trailer, check the flooring of the trailer. Make sure that there's no rotting areas or other defective areas in the trailer floor that could cause you issues when traveling on and off the trailer. Ensure that the trailer wheels are chocked. This is a must. The weight of that forklift going on and off the trailer, and as you travel onto the trailer and apply your brakes, if those trailer tires are not shocked and that forklift's not, or that trailer is not secured, it's going to slide forward to some degree every time you apply the brakes on that forklift and that weight shifts forward. Also, if it's not attached to a tractor, the landing gear on the trailer is not sufficient for supporting the weight of that forklift traveling on and off. You want to make sure that some type of jack stand is available to help support some of that weight and take some of the stress off of the landing gear of the trailer. Also, when traveling with the load, make sure that you adhere to all speed requirements. The recognized indoor speed limit is 5 miles an hour. However, in some locations, whatever company policy dictates, the posted speed limit may be less. I've been in areas where there's a posted speed limit of 3 miles an hour. So you've just got to have an understanding of whatever the policy of that facility is and adhere to that. In outdoor settings, typically 15 miles an hour is the recognized outdoor speed limit on a lift. However, if posted lower, make sure that you adhere to that as well. Also, make sure you yield to pedestrians. Don't take for granted that they see you or that they know what you're doing or where you're going on that lift. That person may be in kind of what we call disconnect mode. They may be walking and just oblivious to the things that are going on around them. So make sure that you do things to make your presence known, yield to them. When going in and out of doorways or aisleways, any type of intersection, make sure you slow down, sound your horn, and watch for pedestrians. If you're in an area where there are traffic signals, especially if you're using a forklift outdoors, make sure that you obey any traffic signals. Also keep in mind, forklifts are not passenger-carrying vehicles. Forklift is designed for the operator and the operator only. In some instances on larger lifts, there may be a factory-installed seat for a spotter or something like that. That would be the only instance where you would have another person on that forklift. Also, making sure you keep your arms and legs inside the cage of the lift at all times. An elbow sticking out or a leg dangling off the forklift can be a recipe for disaster. If you get too close to the wall, too close to the side of a door entrance or doorway or a column, and that could lead to a pretty serious injury. Also, make sure you never jump from a moving forklift, and if you're following or you're in an area where there are multiple forklifts in use, make sure that proper speed and space management is adhered to, and try to keep at least three lift lengths between you and the forklift, and making sure that the ones behind you do the same. One last note to mention on traveling. When traveling, if the load that you're carrying obstructs your view to the front, turn around, drive in reverse with the load trailing so that you have a proper field of vision for travel. Also, making sure that you have adequate clearance. Under structures, maybe elevated walkways or overhead racks. Make sure you have proper clearance when you're going to be raising those forks. Make sure you have proper side-to-side clearance in between structures when entering doorways. If you're using the forklift outside, be extra cautious on the placement of overhead power lines, especially when you're in areas where you're going to be raising the mast. You want to make sure that you have a minimum of 10 feet of separation, but if the conditions allow, try to put as much distance between you and any overhead power lines or power sources as possible. When lifting or using the forklift for material handling, know the weight of the load, know the composition of the load, know where the balance points are. Make sure that you never attach any slings, cables, or chains to the forks to lift materials or objects from underneath them. If for some reason you do use fork extensions, you have to keep in mind that those affect the stability of the lift and that the rated capacity is for the forklift as is. It does not take into account that you're using any attachments, such as those fork extensions. So that's something that you have to keep in mind if there's, for any reason, you do use those extensions. When lifting unstable loads, make sure that they're properly secured before you lift or travel with them. Use tie downs or wide tines and lock in place. Never use counterweights when material handling. And don't lift anything or any piece of equipment that you're unfamiliar with. If you're unfamiliar with it, you don't have an understanding of the weight, you don't have an understanding of the stability of that load, and it could put you in a hazardous situation not having that knowledge. When negotiating ramps or slopes on level surfaces, some things to keep in mind when traveling. If the forklift is loaded, always ensure that the load is against the backrest, that the forks are underneath the load as safely as they can be without damaging the load, and drive forward up the ramp and back down the ramps. This is when the forklift is loaded. When the forklift is unloaded, drive forward down the ramp, drive backwards up the ramp. This is going to give you a better field of vision for traveling. Also, and this is very hazardous on these forklifts, because of their varying centers of gravity, never turn or navigate the forklift sideways on a ramp or any inclined or unlevel surface. This can cause a rollover hazard. When you're going to park the forklift and leave it unattended, there's a couple of steps that you have to follow. Some of those include, when you're going to leave it unattended, you want to lower the forks, neutralize the controls, shut off the engine, and set the brake. Take those 4 steps when you're going to park the forklift and leave it unattended. Also, make sure you park it in a location where it doesn't block exit routes. It doesn't block aisleways, fire escapes. It doesn't block fire extinguishers. Make sure it's in a location where it's not going to be in anybody's way. Make sure that the keys are removed from it. And a forklift is considered unattended when it is out of the operator's line of sight or the operator is more than 25 feet away from the forklift. That's when a forklift is considered unattended. A couple of things to note when we're either refueling or recharging the forklifts. If you're going to place fuel in a gasoline or a diesel-powered lift, or if you're changing the propane tank on a propane lift, make sure that all those things are done outdoors. That should never be done indoors. Also, especially when changing the propane tanks, make sure that you're using PPE such as gloves. This can prevent a frostbite hazard in the event of some type of accidental release of that propane. Also, close the valve on the propane bottle when the engine is running. This is going to consume any gas that's left over in the line, any fuel left in the line. And then again, common sense should tell you don't be smoking when you're doing any of these functions, when you're refueling the forklifts, no matter what type of forklift it is. Also, on these propane lifts, make sure that your bottle is secured before using the forklift. For electric forklifts and the recharging stations, you want to make sure that they're charged in it's an area that's designated, it's posted as a charging area, and it's a well-ventilated area. These battery-powered forklifts, these battery packs are extremely heavy, and most places that have these are going to have a device that assists you in changing these batteries out just due to the weight, which, because of the weight, will take some undue stress off of your lower back. Also, as these things charge, they can produce hydrogen gas, which is very explosive. So it's very important not to be smoking or have these charging stations anywhere near an area where there's spark-producing equipment. And then talking about forklifts and using these in hazardous locations, we have non-hazardous and hazardous forklifts. These have minimum acceptable safeguards against fire hazards. Some of these types are Type D forklifts, which are diesel-powered lifts. Type E or electrically powered forklifts. These have minimum acceptable standards against inherent fire and electrical shock hazards. Type G are gasoline-powered lifts. Type G and L/LP forklifts are either gasoline or liquefied petroleum. And then Type LP are just liquefied petroleum. And keep in mind, these are minimum acceptable safeguards against inherent fire hazards. So those are just the bare minimums. Anything that you do above and beyond that just provides extra protection to your employees. Hazardous forklifts are used in locations where metal dust, organic dust such as peanut dust and other grain dust, flammable vapors and gases may be present. Indoor use of fork trucks requires that verification of safe limits of carbon monoxide emissions are not exceeded. And then that's the same on this slide as well. You have the Type EX forklifts, Type GS, GS, LPS, and Type LPS forklifts. Again, where the non-hazardous types of forklifts, their use may not be acceptable in these areas. Again, if you go back to CFR 29/1910 178, which is OSHA's Powered Industrial Truck Standard, it spells out in great detail all the steps you need to go through to make sure that your employees are properly trained and properly evaluated in using powered industrial trucks. Your training program can go a couple different ways. You can have an in-house training program where you have a competent person who has been trained themselves, and they are able to train and evaluate your other employees on safe use of forklifts. This can be your in-house program. It can be done through PowerPoint training. It can be done through a video. One thing you have to keep in mind, if you're going to show your employees a video for training, you cannot put them in a room, put the video on, and leave them. A competent person has to be available during the course of the video to answer any questions that those employees going through the training may have. You can also use an outside agency to administer your training. This can be done from your forklift supplier or any other third party, a safety consultant, anyone who can properly train your employees on forklift safety. And then the certification is a 3-year certification. However, there are some instances where you will have to have some documented retraining and reevaluation before that 3-year period is up. If an employee is caught horseplaying or performing unsafe acts on the forklift, you should document some type of retraining or reevaluation. If they have an accident involving a forklift, the same goes for that. Immediately you should do some type of remedial training and reevaluation. And if you get a forklift that operates differently than the forklifts they've been trained on, you should also document some type of retraining and reevaluation. Another thing that you'll need to keep in mind, if you have multiple types of forklifts that your employees will be operating, they need to have documented training on each type of forklift. Forklift training is not a one-for-all deal. They have to be trained on each type of equipment, piece of equipment that you have. From a claim standpoint, typically if we see a claim related to a forklift, it's going to be a pretty bad claim, a pretty nasty injury. We're going to have Coley Boone next talk about some of the claims that we have had that are associated with forklifts and improper use.
Yeah, we feel like it's important to quantify this to really send it home. This claim in particular was where an employee crawled underneath the forklift and asked for assistance, and the forklift ended up falling on the employee and crushed him, resulting in death. Not only did the employee lose his life, but over $200,000 were paid out by the work comp carrier, and there were several things that could have been done to prevent this. Another incident happened when there were several employees working together, and an employee was backed into by a forklift and crushed his foot. Later, that injured employee's foot was amputated, and an additional $500,000 was in reserve for the payout on that claim. And next we have Jim Halford, who's Vice President of Loss Control. He's going to wrap things up.
Thanks, Scott and Coley. You guys did a great job. Let me reiterate something about forklifts, or powered industrial trucks as they're known. They're a very, very high interest item to OSHA. If there is a recordable forklift accident or incident, you can pretty much bet you're going to get a visit from OSHA. And you really need to have your ducks in a row when they come, because forklifts they take very seriously. When you're operating a forklift, you're the guy or the gal those workers out there. You're responsible for your safety. You're responsible for the company's liability, because if you're operating in an unsafe manner, not only are you going to be scrutinized, but your company's training will be also. You need to know your equipment. You need to know the load limits. Know the mechanical functions of each kind and type. Know the controls, know how to refuel, and know your clearances and your turn radiuses. And we go back a minute to the types of forklifts we talked about earlier. Not only do you need to be certified in each type, but say you have 2 Hyster forklifts and 2 Cat forklifts, and each one has a different load rating, a 5,000, a 10,000, a 15, or a 20. You have to have a certification in your file that you have been trained and certified to operate each one of those weight limit forklifts. You can't operate a 10,000-pound forklift with a 5,000-pound certificate. So keep that in mind. You want to follow safety rules, not just the rules of the original equipment manufacturer, not just Hyster's rules, not just OSHA's rules. See what your company policies are. Many companies have specific policies for forklift drivers, so you always need to be following those rules. Need to know your load. You know, what are you carrying? You don't want to carry a stack of dynamite through a wall of fire. You don't want to carry loads that are loose and shifting without tying them down. Know what you have on your forks at all times. We saw earlier in a slide that 11% of all forklifts in the country were involved in some type of accident this year. I really disagree with that. An accident is something you cannot foresee. It's something you can't prevent. It's something that didn't happen because of something you did. Accidents are just that, accidents. 11% of forklifts were involved in incidents. An incident usually occurs because of something someone does, and it's usually because of not following safety rules. So let's keep that in mind while we're out there operating. We don't want any incidents. We want to get everybody to go back home the same way they came to work, safe and sound and in one piece. In final, our mission statement here is for you to ensure a safe ride on your powered industrial truck. You'll do that by knowing your equipment, knowing the safety rules, and following them diligently. We appreciate everybody that tuned in today and looked at this video, and if you have any questions at all, please give us a shout.
At this time, if you'd like to ask a question, remember you can use the Q&A box located on the lower right-hand side of your screen to send a message over the web. Again, it's located on the lower right-hand side of your screen. At this time, there are no questions. Thank you again for joining us today, and we hope you found this information informative. After you exit the webinar, you will be redirected to a survey. Please take the time to fill in the information requested, as your feedback is greatly appreciated. This does conclude today's web conference. You may now disconnect.